In a limited sense, I think we got to understand the union movement. And when I say union movement, I make a distinction between the union movement and the labor movement. Clearly, the union movement is only the organized portion of the labor movement. The labor movement, as our scripture pointed out to early, is all of those who work by the sweat of their brow. Whether you sell mental or physical labor, some get confused thinking that they're selling mental labor, they are not workers. Some selling mental or physical workers, whether you work in the countryside or in the city, whether you paid by the hour or all at once, whether you work part-time or half-time or not at all, if you once used to work and are no longer able, if you once used to work and now unemployed, if you wanted to work and can't get there, all of this represents the scope of the labor movement. And therefore, the union movement is only an organized portion, of the labor movement. And I think when we stand here and talk to each other, we always like to address ourselves from the standpoint of the labor movement. Now, unionism is beginning to show some of its weaknesses. I said earlier that some of the unions don't even want to march no more. They're scared to flex their muscles and strut their stuff. I think they're afraid they may make somebody mad if they see the numbers that they have. But unions have historically fought for the increase in the wages and the improvement of the working conditions that workers fought for. But the problem is that you always fought for one set of workers in one plant, in one industry. You were stuck there. Today, the tactics of the past are proving themselves ineffective. Unions can no longer get increases. As a matter of fact, they go to the negotiating table selling for losses. They go to the negotiating table and come back with a loss in health care benefits and a cutback in their pensions. Let me say that these tasks in front of us are not easy. Labor has a lot of difficulties. It needs a class party. It needs a party of people that's going to recognize all those that labor and not represent those that don't. We need a party that's going to stand up and not afraid of energizing its base. Why would these parties be afraid of energizing their base and go after the people that's so oppressed and free them up, so they can get to the polls and bring the rest of society along with it? What is wrong with them today? But we need to understand that only by uniting with the goals of those on the bottom of society can we uplift the whole thing. On the question of solidarity, the famous union song. And what I can understand from Elise Bryant, Solidarity Forever was adapted to the song that was formed by the soldiers leaving the battlefield in the Civil War. And if you notice, Solidarity Forever is to the same tune of a Battle Hymn of the Republic. In the process of solidarity, I learned some things, and I gave this example once before because it's the most bitter one I learned in my life. It's an event that took place on October the 3rd, 1991, in a little city called Hamlet, North Carolina, at a factory called the Imperial Foods that produced chicken nuggets. And what happened on that September the 3rd, a fire broke out in that factory. And 25 workers died in that fire. When the word spread across the country, we all got angry and upset. We raised money at our local and our region, and we sent packages of money to the survivors of that. But that was not enough. Our anger had to take more of a direct affront. On May the 2nd of 1992, we organized 5 busloads of workers out of Region 5. We collected money and we rode to Hamlet, North Carolina. We got there, it was a gruesome sight. We got a chance to go inside the factory and we saw, what used to be the refrigerators that became the tombs of most of those workers. You could see the flesh marks on the doors as they clawed and tried to get their way out. But the owner of the factory had chained all the doors shut because he claimed somebody was trying to steal his chicken nuggets. We marched through the streets of Hamlet that day. When we got to the rally at the park, it was a real spirited rally, but one of the most bitter lessons that we had to learn was out of the 25 workers that died in that factory, 13 were white and 12 were black. Not a single one of the members of the white families showed up at that rally, even though the money was for everybody. And it was a bitter pill for us to swallow, you see. This question of solidarity is not an easy question. It got to be fought for. You see, the factory united them. The process of the production of chicken nuggets united them. The fire that broke out in that factory that day united them. The slow hand of death that touched 25 workers united them, but brothers and sisters, the streets divided them. When we raise our voice to sing solidarity, we got to fight to give that meaning. You know, the song says solidarity forever. It don't say solidarity for 8 hours. It don't say solidarity to the midnight hour in case you're working the second shift. That song says solidarity forever. And every time we raise it and fight for it, we got to fight to get.
The man you just heard speaking was a Detroit-born labor activist named General Baker. Up until his passing in 2014, he was well known for his dedication to not only reform the union movement, which had lasting issues in dealing with racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, but in his advocacy for the broader labor movement as well, right? He makes that distinction between the labor movement and the union movement. We haven't gotten to spend a lot of time discussing the labor movement in the United States much this semester, and some of this is just because of the constraints we have to put on class with the pandemic. You know, this means we just don't have as much time to delve deeper into some aspects of history that we would normally like to. But for this lecture, we're really going to need to return to the labor movement because its decline in the 70s and 80s is going to tie in directly with a host of issues that we're facing today. Issues that range from access to healthcare, workplace safety, to economic opportunity. General Baker discusses the Hamlet Imperial Foods fire that broke out in North Carolina in 1991. Why were the owners of the chicken processing plant able to get away with putting locks on the fire escape doors? Why did the families of white and black workers remain divided even though they had both lost loved ones to the greed of plant owners? Why don't we see the robust union movement or labor movement today that generations before us ostensibly seem to take for granted? To answer these questions, we need to critically investigate deindustrialization, or more specifically, how deindustrialization affected the labor movement, American workers and families, and economic opportunity nationwide. But before we jump into lecture, right, we should read our starting quote because it's going to inform a lot about what we're talking about today. It's by Angela Davis, and she says, "Prisons do not disappear social problems. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy only disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages." You may have noticed in this lecture's subheading that we're going to talk about more than just deindustrialization today, but austerity politics and mass incarceration as well. How are the decline of the labor movement and deindustrialization and mass incarceration all linked together, though? It's a complicated and nuanced question, but nonetheless, today's lecture is going to serve as an attempt to answer that question. So let's get started. Now, if you'll recall from some of our lectures from earlier in the semester, it can help to remind ourselves of a couple of things before we get started, right? First is that at the end of World War II, Americans had to start to interact with one another and the rest of society in profoundly different ways than they had before. Televisions and other forms of mass media make it easier for Americans to get their news, and at the same time, other technological innovations completely reshape how Americans live their lives at home and perform their jobs. Refrigerators, washing machines, and more affordable cars promote suburban growth, and by extension, the single-family unit is the country's kind of default building block of social organization, right? The Leave It to Beaver, the suburbs, the white picket fence, this all becomes essentially reinforced and emboldened by a lot of these new technologies. Meanwhile, post-war technology reorients the workplace too. Specifically, factories start to become more efficient, allowing companies to produce more and more products, but requiring fewer workers to do so. While all of this is going on, and all of this technology starts to reshape American daily life and social norms, the Red Scare is reaching its zenith. While the government and social purges associated with the Red Scare were initially aimed to root communists out of the US State Department and other areas of prospective power, the Red Scare's spread throughout American society also chilled free speech. Labor organizers, peace activists, feminists, civil rights activists all faced considerable repression. Even after the Red Scare ends, operations like COINTELPRO continue to undermine and suppress peaceful grassroots movements that are calling for reform. And lastly, recall that in 1968, in that year's presidential election, Nixon and his Republican Party overtake the different Democratic candidates in what historians now point to as the collapse of the New Deal coalition. While the New Deal coalition was far from perfect, it was a political regime that made efforts to respond to pressures from forces like the Civil Rights Movement. We see this with the passage of legislation like the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1975 Voting Rights Act, right? The government is responding to protest. The emerging neoconservative political movement heralded by Nixon's election placed a greater emphasis on law and order, though, right? The Nixon administration and administrations after it weren't going to respond to protest. They weren't going to respond to civil uprisings because they had the approval of the silent majority, right? The silent majority wanted law and order. So for our lecture today, we're basically going to move through 5 main topics, which, at least for the most part, are going to be presented in chronological order. We'll start off by talking about what deindustrialization is and how deindustrialization as a process started to take off in the United States. Then we'll move to discuss how deindustrialization affected the country on a large scale. How do states and cities change as capital flight and industrial migration reshape communities and regional geographies? Then we'll take a closer look at how deindustrialization affected American standards of living, right? How did American families and American workers contend with deindustrialization, and what other pressures emerged as the economic power of the American working class and the political power of unions went into freefall? We'll spend some brief time discussing how the process of deindustrialization continued through the 1990s and in many ways continues today, and what that means for our political reality. Then we'll end by focusing on one example of how deindustrialization and reduced economic opportunity coalesce to form current crises, like the establishment of the prison industrial complex and its reliance on mass incarceration. So that might seem like a tall order to cover in one day, right? Where do we even start? Well, let's begin by discussing what deindustrialization actually is. In conventional terms, deindustrialization is the process where light and heavy industry, especially industrial manufacturing, leaves an area or a community. Deindustrialization can bring economic hardship to an area or even an entire region if other industries and competing forms of economic activity don't exist to provide enough jobs to replace those that are lost. If a factory closes in a town because of different economic pressures and other changing conditions, what happens to the people that live there? Can they find work somewhere else? What happens to them and their families if they can't? And not only just them, what happens to that community's economic activity and that community's well-being if so many people lose their jobs, lose employment? What happens when this problem becomes more widespread? So why does deindustrialization happen? What can prompt a company to leave an entire community behind to move elsewhere? Well, deindustrialization can occur for a variety of reasons, and we have just a couple listed here below. First, companies may decide that opening a new plant is just cheaper than upgrading one they already have. In the post-war economic boom period, this is going to be a particularly prominent excuse, right? We have all this new technology. Why upgrade the old factory when we can build a new one somewhere else far cheaper? Companies might also leave a community because of different tax incentives, workplace or environmental regulations, or other differences like established wage rates and other laws, right? Our lease on this plant, our lease on this land, this building is coming up, but we could save a lot more money if we just move production over to this place instead. So why don't we do that? How much does labor cost in an area? That factors into things too, right? If a community elsewhere can do the same work for a much lower cost, even if a company is viable to operate in the area it's already in, companies can still relocate in order to make even greater profits, right? Why should I pay the workers more if workers somewhere else will do the same job for cheaper? New technologies in manufacturing can require far fewer workers to produce the same product. So even if a company doesn't leave an area, new machinery might mean that they end up laying off 80% or more of their workers just because more efficient technology doesn't mean they need as many workers there, right? That still counts as a form of deindustrialization because those industrial jobs are still lost. And lastly, there's other economic issues that can happen, right? Recessions, changes in market demand, and other factors can all combine to drive a company out of business, potentially bankrupting them if they don't adopt necessary changes to keep their doors open. Well, most of this lecture is going to follow the 1970s and beyond. It's worth mentioning that deindustrialization had been taking place in some parts of the US long before 1968 and this collapse of this New Deal coalition. In Detroit, for example, auto companies started closing factories as early as 1945, right? The 1940s and 1950s, shortly after the United States leaves World War II. These shuttered factories were commonly referred to as ghost plants, and their abandoned locations can still be seen in neighborhoods nearby Wayne State, right? Neighborhoods like New Center, North End, and Milwaukee Junction. Now, ghost plants isn't a term that we use popularly today, right? Or it wasn't even a term that was still often used in the 1970s. Most often, by the 1970s, the time this period rolls around, factories that are closed by companies so they can be relocated elsewhere for more profits are referred to as runaway shops, right? The plant isn't dying, it's just leaving the community to go somewhere else. So why did companies start moving out of cities and into suburbs so early? A lot of this comes down to new technology, right? Like we said a couple slides ago. Technology developed during the war made it a lot easier and cheaper to build new things like cars and appliances and other manufactured goods, but the same new technology usually required entirely new factory layouts. Architectural designs that emphasize single-story production would take up much more of an area. And because land was cheaper in developing suburbs, when you compare that to these inner city locations where a lot of these plants were built originally, many companies just abandoned their older plants to relocate elsewhere. Spreading factories out across metropolitan areas also had the benefit of weakening labor unions, right? As factories grew further apart, it became more difficult to coordinate with workers and plan labor actions that were essential to get corporate leaders to bargain with employees over matters like wages and benefits. This first phase of deindustrialization, this first phase taking place in the 1940s and 1950s, was largely limited to wider metropolitan communities, right? As cities start to expand outward and grow in this period of suburbanization, a lot of these plants are just going to leave the interior of the city and relocate out in the suburbs. And so while Black Americans and other Americans of color who were kept out of predominantly white suburbs lose out on many well-paying manufacturing jobs, white suburban communities continue to benefit from manufacturing employment. This is part of why when you hear people talk about deindustrialization, they mostly end up talking about the 1970s, because this is when deindustrialization started to affect white people. But we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the fact that this process had been going on for far longer and far earlier. Now, if you recall some discussions we had earlier on in the semester, you'll remember that the labor movement really started to stall out during the 1950s, right? When the Red Scare was ongoing. Operation Dixie, the labor movement's attempt to integrate the South through cross-racial union organizing campaigns, was quickly quashed by the combined forces of anti-labor business interests, anti-civil rights racist reaction, and just in general anti-union legislation that we see in things like the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947. Because of this, the Southern United States was able to maintain a legacy of lower wages and fewer protections and benefits for workers when compared to places like the industrial Northeast and Midwest. This regional difference wasn't immediately important nationwide when you look at labor relations, when you look at pay and compensation. It wasn't immediately visible how this would be a problem, but these regional differences become more and more important as efforts like the interstate highway system neared completion and made industrial production in the American South a more viable, a more profitable option for American companies. Industry had less of a reason to stay in the predominantly industrial Northeast and Midwest as the United States South continued to modernize and industrialize. These were the areas first affected by deindustrialization on a truly massive scale. And the entire region, right, this industrial Northeast and Midwest, is now often referred to as the Rust Belt because of the shared history of industrial decline. In the second wave of deindustrialization, many plants in the Rust Belt closed and relocated to southern and western states, where not only was land and labor cheaper, but environmental and workplace safety and wage regulations were also more relaxed. States that saw manufacturing and industrial growth in the 1970s at the expense of migration out of the Northeast and Midwest are often referred to as the Sun Belt, right? This kind of contrary region in opposition to the Rust Belt that you can see highlighted in red. Well, deindustrialization affected many manufacturing jobs like the auto industry, textiles, and even furniture, if we're looking at Michigan industries. Other industries were affected too. The output of steel and coal industries also decreased because of the decline of manufacturing, leading steel mills in Ohio and coal mines in West Virginia to struggle with decreased demand. When fewer companies are buying steel, when fewer companies are buying coal because they're laying off workers or relocating elsewhere, you're going to have to lay off workers too, right? Not only were resource extraction industries facing decline in the 1970s, but community businesses and institutions that had evolved alongside major industries started to suffer as well. Community grocery stores, bars, shops, and others all faced increased economic pressure as departing factories left communities without incomes, meaning that businesses had fewer clients that they needed to keep their doors open. As the economic situation in many Rust Belt communities worsened, people began to leave for work in other parts of the country, though they often did so without union representation and saw reduced wages in the process. If you work at a metal stamping plant in Sterling Heights, Michigan in 1970, when they put out the notice that they're closing at the end of the year and you make $5.50 an hour, they tell you not to worry because you can go with them to their new facility in Tennessee where you'll be paid a very decent wage for the area, right? A solid $2.20 an hour down there. It's a pretty big pay cut for a lot of people, and for many families it was unsustainable. Schools and other social programs similarly struggled to keep their doors open as student populations dropped, and reduced tax-based incomes prompted cities to reduce funding for social programs, right? And this isn't just schools in the education industry. This is things like social programs that cities and states would undertake to make sure people were getting medical care, were able to access food stamps and groceries, could still move around even if they didn't have a car, right? Do you have a pass to ride public transit or not? All of these things start to see reduced funding. So throughout the 1970s, deindustrialization accelerates throughout the Rust Belt as more factories closed to either relocate to southern states or relocate elsewhere, not necessarily in the South, but to build new plants where there wouldn't be a union and they could import a lot of brand new automated fancy technology that didn't require as many workers. And these changes amounted to losses of millions of jobs in a very short time. While some groups tried to prevent plant closings and relocations through legal or public relations battles, most efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. How can a community prevent a profitable factory or industry from leaving when so many people in that community depend on that industry for work? Labor activists and unions in the 1970s sought to fight runaway shops in court battles and in contract negotiations by demonstrating how departing companies were harming the communities that they were leaving behind, right? You're leaving these communities where you've had people working for you for 2 or 3 decades. Your company operating here is still profitable. Why can't you stay? And a company would turn around and just say, well, it's none of your business. We can make more money basing production elsewhere, so that's what we're going to do. Hard stop. Are companies beholden to the welfare of communities they employ workers in? Labor activists and unions believed so. However, the post-New Deal court system and political regime disagreed. Labor unions may want may have wanted the government to intervene in the economy to ensure a certain standard of living for American workers, but after the passage of Taft-Hartley and the failure of Operation Dixie, the labor movement showed that it had been, effectively stripped of its political might. Well, the companies they fought against hadn't. Property rights of the individual, and by extension of individual companies, remained sacrosanct, and the industrial migration out of the Rust Belt was able to continue without slowing down much. So it's probably safe to say that deindustrialization negatively affected the Rust Belt, right? And while some folks in the Sun Belt saw more jobs with factories moving into their communities, these jobs rarely paid anywhere close to the wages that Rust Belt workers had enjoyed a decade previously, right, before these industries had started to leave. But what does this industrial migration look like for the workers affected by it? Well, once high-paying manufacturing jobs left an area, jobs that remained available to workers were often characterized by low pay, irregular hours, and were often only part-time. For a lot of American workers, this is still the case today, right? And this made doing things like supporting a family, putting food on the table, and keeping the lights on and the water on increasingly more difficult. Well, the New Deal coalition had continuously paid lip service to this goal of full employment, where all workers would eventually be able to bring home a living wage. Precarious minimum wage and short-term employment made the kind of economic opportunity enjoyed during the post-war boom seem like an increasingly distant memory. Workers were forced to rely on service jobs. They had to struggle through 2 large recessions during this period as well, which only intensified economic anxieties and household losses. In 1973, shocks in the petroleum industry and an embargo directed at the United States by OPEC for its support of the State of Israel drove up inflation while the economy stagnated at the same time. This process was known as stagflation, and it was particularly difficult for the American economy. Volatile oil markets also drove down interest in less fuel-efficient American-made cars, with foreign cars taking up an increasing share of the market, further damaging this automotive base of the Rust Belt's manufacturing economy. The material losses of deindustrialization on workers in Rust Belt states ended up being enormous, right? As vehicle production falls in Michigan, for example, so too does the average family income and purchasing power. You can see that in these 2 slides, kind of right next to each other, right? These 2 graphs here demonstrate how deindustrialization negatively affected the lives of workers in Michigan. Now, Michigan is just one Rust Belt state, mind you. These same constraints were being felt across hundreds of American communities, and while many factory closures stereotypically occurred in this industrial Northeast and Midwest, economic activity all across the United States suffered as a result of deindustrialization. Michigan workers used to be paid far higher than the national average for the industrial manufacturing labor they performed, right? In the 1950s, Michigan per capita income is 20% higher than the national average. These wages were won by the labor movement through costly unionization battles of the 1930s and 1940s, right, during the Great Depression and World War II. And because of these unionization rates, post-war Detroit was widely regarded as the richest city per capita in the world, right? The average family living in Detroit is going to be richer on average than any other family in any other city in the world at the end of World War II. As deindustrialization continued, though, these wages continued to decline, leading to a host of social problems that would not simply go away because they were being ignored. As deindustrialization continued, the labor movement's power continued to experience this rapid decline, right? Between 1950, when the first wave of deindustrialization began occurring in American cities, and in 1989, when this kind of intranational within different US states, right, this second wave of industrial migration southward. In 1989, this begins to slow a bit. Workforce participation in the labor movement falls from over 30% in 1950 to less than 14% by 1989, right? It's more than cut in half. And today, America's unionization rate sits at just under 11%, one of the lowest points it's been at, including the unionization rate on the eve of the Great Depression. So as we've mentioned, right, lower union membership and participation translates to not only lower pay, but also fewer benefits like seniority, health care, or retirement pensions, which in turn mean greater economic hardship. Prior to this point, for example, anti-communist Americans had argued successfully against national welfare regimes because industrial companies were able to provide a lot of these benefits to workers through contracts negotiated by unions, right? This was part of this post-war economic New Deal model. The US government doesn't need to provide healthcare because anyone can get a job and get healthcare almost immediately, right? This is just kind of the standard. With union participation declining, fewer workers enjoyed healthcare access as debt, bills, and other stressors begin to increase. Diminished social safety nets could not contend with widening economic disparities either, right? SNAP and WIC, food stamps, and other kinds of programs of social uplift might work when you have a couple hundred people in a community who need them, but when that number raises to several thousands or tens of thousands, those kinds of social welfare services don't really hold their own. But how do you address these social issues if the ways they were handled previously, by government regulation, by social welfare services, by union protections? How do you address these social issues if the way these things are handled and addressed previously are done away with? As governments drew in reduced incomes from income tax and corporate taxes, they sought to encourage new spending and investment by lowering tax rates and paying for further cuts in spending by cutting sorely needed social welfare programs and other community provisions. This idea that by cutting taxes and spending you can incentivize economic growth is often referred to as austerity, though the term Reaganomics is sometimes used, or trickle-down economics, since President Reagan promoted austerity measures during his tenure as president throughout the 1980s. We ask what austerity looks like, right? When Lady T. Tempest, the performer we listened to last week, talked about the government cutting HIV and AIDS research funding and treatment, she was referring to as an example of austerity. The government is going to incentivize economic growth by cutting taxes on the rich so they'll open up more factories, but we're going to do this by cutting social services. As other national economies began to recover and grow following World War II, industry ties and trade between the United States and other countries also begins to deepen, right? We talked about this at some length when we discussed the Marshall Plan. Rebuilding Europe, Japan, South Korea, and other allied nations made it less likely that their populations would vote for communism, and it tied their economic interests to America's at the same time, right? So it was kind of a win-win. But as companies in these countries become more competitive globally, American companies start to see increased pressure to cut waste and center short-term profits as a way to remain viable. Increased trade wasn't just a method American politicians used to tie the US with its allies, right? Nixon's strategy of détente also relied on relaxing trade restrictions with geopolitical rivals to drive a wedge between them and the Soviet Union. This is one of the reasons why Nixon travels to China in the 1970s, is to meet with Mao and open up trade and drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and mainland China. This freeing up of trade provided Chinese manufacturing with new American markets, making war less likely. However, these new products also undercut the amount of goods American companies could sell in domestic markets. Right? So you can see how free trade also kind of can add to these economic pressures that are driving deindustrialization at the end of the New Deal coalition. We've mentioned relaxing trade and trading restrictions a couple of times in this lecture, so it's probably worth taking a moment to address what the term free trade means, right? To put it in basic terms, free trade describes the system in place where goods, services, and investment can move freely across borders without government regulations, or without trading tariffs or other protectionist kinds of legislation that get in the way of trade. Free trade sounds like an excellent idea for promoting economic growth, but critics have argued that systems of free trade often produce benefits for the owners of companies without benefiting the workers in either other country very much, right? They instead support the creation of systems of fair trade. Fair trade, by contrast, is an ethical consumption movement that advocates for better trade conditions for producers in developing countries. Are workers in the global south paid a living wage by first world companies employing them in their own home countries? What about access to medical care? Products with fair trade labels have undergone some limited investigation to ensure workers have some protections against exploitation. But the majority of globalized industry and trade is free trade, meaning that most workers don't enjoy these limited protections, right? Are workers in third world countries allowed to form unions? Are workers in third world countries given health care by their employers? Not necessarily. These concepts may seem abstract when they're presented in this way, but remember how General Baker discussed the Hamlet Imperial Foods Fire. Economic pressure to keep employment in an area meant that a lot of governments, not only in southern states, but in small communities, throughout the 1980s and 1990s could be hesitant to regulate workplaces if it meant that those companies might leave their communities the same way they abandoned Northeastern and Midwestern communities in the 1970s. At the same time, continued and maintained systems of division ensured that workers could not unite against corporate interests in the same way that workers had in the 1930s amid the Great Depression. In a bid to retain jobs and industries, even communities that had historically relied on tighter economic regulations began to loosen them, right? The hope was that by loosening restrictions, by lowering regulations, that some of these companies either might come to my community if they haven't already, or they might return to my community after they had left. This results in what economists often refer to as a race to the bottom, right? All of these different communities are fighting over an industry to locate to their area, and so they give increasingly lucrative terms. This process of internationalizing economic activity is known as globalization, right? And while the practice of globalization has arguably limited major armed conflicts around the world, it has also proven to be economically difficult for workers all around the world. First world workers have to contend with job loss, declines in pay, tenuous employment, and workers across the third world face greater exploitation, environmental damage to their communities, and a risk of severe injury at work far higher than most Americans have ever had to experience in living memory. In 1993, globalization as a policy was enshrined by the United States government when the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was created. NAFTA resulted in the creation of the world's largest free trade bloc at that point, and was an attempt by the Bush and Clinton administrations of the 1990s to better integrate the economies of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. NAFTA was opposed by critics of globalization as well as the organized labor movement because of its potential to exacerbate deindustrialization, which, in all actuality, began its third and most recent wave shortly after NAFTA was ratified. So the ratification of NAFTA saw the creation of much cheaper products, but also saw a rise in outsourcing, right? This process in which companies relocate production to foreign countries to take advantage of cheaper labor and production costs. In the 1950s, they were ghost plants. In the 1970s, they were runaway shops. And most recently, it's globalization and outsourcing. Well, many historians consider the timing of deindustrialization to be from the 1970s until about the 1990s. The greatest loss in US manufacturing jobs occurred at the start of the 21st century, when globalization as an economic force started to get underway. Examples of this third wave of deindustrialization brought on by globalization can be seen all around us in the recent waves of factory closings that began to emerge in the news in the 1990s and continue through to today. Deindustrialization and the increased centrality of precarious, part-time minimum wage labor at the expense of earlier calls for full employment means that while the economically powerful bring in greater profits, Americans collectively make less in income today than they did at the end of World War II. And this is despite being multitudes more productive than they ever have been at any point in history before now. While several factors led to the 2008 recession, many economists pointed to lack of regulation in the banking sector and high levels of income inequality that deindustrialization and the decline of the labor movement were able to usher in. Since 1970, differences between CEO pay compared to worker pay have increased, despite companies being more profitable. That trickling down of economic wealth doesn't necessarily always come through. Economists have argued that when workers are paid less, they spend less, and this puts the economy in greater risk. Accompanying the rise in income inequality are continual cuts in corporate tax rates and taxes on the income of more affluent and rich Americans. Cuts in tax rates for corporations and richer Americans, while providing for some short-term economic growth at times, also limits how much the government can spend on social programs, things like education and infrastructure, without contributing to a growing national debt. As the economy continues to restructure in the wake of deindustrialization, more workers are forced to forego full-time jobs with benefits for available, though often unstable and unreliable, part-time work. As demand for jobs has risen, with fewer full-time positions available, more Americans have been willing to work at minimum wage levels. So, as we've seen, deindustrialization has given us scores of social problems. Americans today work harder and make less because of deindustrialization and the decline of the labor movement. At the same time, economic austerity and other trickle-down approaches to economic redistribution mean that the majority of profits made through economic production today stay in the hands of the rich and powerful. Well, the national and numerous state welfare programs that were constructed during Johnson's Great Society and Roosevelt's New Deal are increasingly defunded if they don't go bankrupt entirely first. If a government isn't going to intervene in the economy to protect the health of communities and won't raise taxes on the wealthy to make up for budget shortfalls, then how are the social problems that come with economic inequality and a lack of opportunity addressed? This is where we should spend some time talking about mass incarceration, because what happens with deindustrialization directly paves the way for what happens next.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively, and the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically it was 100 per 100,000, now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9. The research shows that kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out. And there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
So if we're going to talk about mass incarceration, we need to acknowledge that as a system, it overwhelmingly and disproportionately targets African Americans and other people of color. This is just a matter of fact that comes with the emergence of a punitive system in a country that, let's be honest, has a long established system of racialized hierarchies and white supremacy. Now, it's worth mentioning that this doesn't mean white people aren't affected by mass incarceration, right? White people are also imprisoned in the US at far greater numbers than in other industrialized nations, but the degree to which Black people and other people of color are criminalized by the mass incarceration system should not and cannot be overlooked. As the US economy continued to decline, increased crime prompted states and local governments to put greater emphasis on policing and funding for prisons. Now, for anyone who was able to listen to the podcast about the Kerner Commission and the Kerner Commission report, you'll know that this was the exact opposite of what advisors looking at civil unrest and urban rioting were advising the government to do, right? Put more money into employment, put more money into education. But this is not heeded, right? Instead, tough on crime laws and a prominent new law and order discourse begin to emerge in the 1970s and continue throughout the 1980s. This discourse asserted that rising levels of crime had no basis in economic hardship whatsoever. Instead, people who committed crimes were simply doing these crimes because they chose to do bad things. The best way to solve the problem, politicians argued, in increasing uniformity was to lock them up and throw away the key. When we talk about uniformity too, it's worth remembering that tough on crime laws were favored by Democrats as well as Republicans. On this graph here, you can see the state of California's incarceration rate, which is largely and almost at least on the federal level, is consistently represented by the Democratic Party in contrast to the Republican Party, right? There are Republican strongholds in California, but it is one of these liberal bastions in the United States. And on this graph here, you can see that California's incarceration rate compared to the US national average is not very far off, right? And when it's compared with other major countries like the United Kingdom, Portugal, Canada, etc., it's still astronomically high. Popular stereotypes and misconceptions can lead people to assume that the prison industrial complex, that massive funding for prisons and police, and that mass incarceration was a Republican initiative because the Republican Party controlled much of the federal government after 1968 for a very long time. But mass incarceration was very much a bipartisan effort. Here we have an article by the New York Times dating back to 1991, when the United States achieved notoriety for its mass incarceration rate. The actual article you can see at the very top of the news page. It doesn't actually get that much space for the weight of what it's really discussing here, right? In 1991, 426 out of every 100,000 people could be expected to be incarcerated at any given point in time. That number is much higher today, you might recall. It's closer to 750 to 800 per 100,000. But what that essentially means is that if you knew 1,000 people, in your life, and most of us know more than 1,000 people, right? We might be hard pressed to think of 1,000 names at the drop of a hat, but we know a lot of people. We're social organisms. If you know 1,000 people, at least 4 of them, but now closer to 8, are imprisoned right now. You just might not be thinking about it. With nearly double the per capita rate of incarceration when compared to the Soviet Union and scores higher than apartheid South Africa, we have to ask how America will continue dealing with its social problems. Is mass incarceration a sustainable system? Maybe. What about for a democratic society? Does mass incarceration solve social problems? That might depend on what your definitions for democratic or solved are. Right? There are advocates of mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. And they do base these arguments on qualitative data, and they'll point to mass incarceration as a good force. So there are people who believe in a system of mass incarceration as it being a genuinely good thing. What do you believe? As political citizens, as people who are engaging with national, state, and local politics, you have to make up your mind on this too. Some of these conversations, some of these topics and issues are actually going to come out in some of our discussion board posts for the week, right? There will be, among some of the other discussion board prompts available for you to kind of pick and choose which two you want to respond to. One of those is going to be about the process of deindustrialization, right? The process wherein these very high-paying manufacturing jobs are leaving the country, and it's going to kind of ask what could have been done. And as we see some of these deindustrial processes ramping up again, what can be done going forward, right? How can we learn from history in the past in addressing problems of today? That's a particularly big point I've been really wanting folks to take away from this class this past semester, right? To really draw from. Another question is going to be on the war on drugs, specifically how the war on drugs relates to not only mass incarceration, but specifically racialized and discriminatory mass incarceration that targets certain groups more than others, regardless of crime ratios and these sorts of things. So make sure you participate in those two discussion board posts. Make sure you reply to some of your colleagues and have those respectful and fruitful discussions together. I'll be keeping tabs and kind of monitoring chats as I have been. And so I'm looking forward to reading over some of these conversations too. Something that's really going to help with these conversations, but it's also really going to help with wrapping up the end of the semester and putting together a really strong history zine for this final project together, is doing the readings, right? So make sure you're staying on top of those. For this week, we have 2 chapters out of our textbook, These United States. That's chapter 6 and chapter 7. And we also have some shorter articles. The first is on the labor movement, how the decline of the labor movement specifically has started to reshape not only American politics, as probably you've noticed that when we talked about like the decline of the New Deal coalition and these sorts of things, but how the decline of the labor movement is even starting to affect regional geography, national demographics, how communities are shaped and how they transform over time and change. There will also be an article about ending the war on drugs. It's an article by the Center for American Progress. So make sure you check that one out too, especially if the war on drugs and criminalization and the what's sometimes referred to as the mass carceral state, the prison industrial complex, this practice of, for all intents and purposes, enslaving a good portion of the population, because people who are in prison can be compelled to work without pay. Really addressing some of those topics as well. If you're feeling a little uncertain about your standing in the class, about your grade, keep in mind that we do have these optional extra credit film reviews. The 4th one is going to be for this week. It's a documentary produced in 1983 about U.S. involvement in the country of Nicaragua, specifically after 1979, how the U.S. government was using funds that it had gained from the Iran-Contra scandal. You'll learn more about that in some of these other lectures. How the funds taken out of the Iran-Contra dealings were used to funnel these death squads in Nicaragua. They were called the Contras. How these funds were used to fund death squads in Nicaragua fighting against this kind of sort of leftist government run by the Sandinistas. So that documentary is going to cover that. The requirements for those responses, again, aren't too strict. You can respond kind of just like with a general, I didn't know this was a thing and this is what I've learned. Or you can kind of dig a little deeper and say, I don't know how people in the 1980s would have responded to this. But based on history lectures and some of my readings, I can assume that it would have been received this way. So don't be afraid to really kind of, if you haven't already, jump right into those extra credit reviews. They're a really easy way to get extra credit points and really shore up your standing in the class, especially if you're not quite sure about where you're at. And on that note, of course, as always, don't be afraid to reach out with any questions or concerns. I'm always here to help. I'm just a Canvas message or an email away, so don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll be responding to you as soon as I can to make sure that those needs are addressed right away.